In this presentation, I want to present some of my research from way back in the day, the 1990s, my God, about sanctions, specifically the conditions under which interrupting trade actually has an effect on a target and what the distribution of costs are. Now, we start out with a three-nation model, and I adapted this from Gardner and Kimbrough, 1990. And we need a three-nation model. This is the key thing. And they're not common in economics. Generally, international trade is either two nations trading with one another or one nation trading with the rest of the world. Well, what about when we have two nations trading and there's also a rest of the world? There's not a lot on that, but Gardner and Kimbrough presented that, and they looked at the effect of country-specific tariffs, which sounded to me an awful lot like a sanction, right? Just, because sometimes sanctions can be tariffs. In trade negotiations, that's very frequently what they are. And so basically a country-specific tariff, a country-specific trade barrier is essentially a sanction, an interruption in trade. And so I adapted the model. And the model starts out, right, we have a sanctioner and a target. And for simplicity's sake, I assume there's one product in the world, M. And that product, M, is produced by the target and sold to the sanctioner. It's also produced and consumed in the rest of the world. But the key thing is at the beginning of or the reference model here is the free trade environment where there is no barrier to trade between the sanctioner and target. And here we have a quantity QST of M being traded between the target and the sanctioner. And notice in the middle, we have a world price of M. So the price of M is P prime, right? We're just going to call it P prime. Meanwhile, the rest of the world produces, consumes a quantity Q rho of M at P prime. Okay, so this is where we start. Now, the first thing to look at it was basically the threshold condition, right? When do we not have an effect, right? And it turns out it's basically there's a threshold, right? And it comes down to this: if the sanctioner imports less of M from the target than is produced in the rest of the world, so if QST is less than Q rho, then sanctions by S on good M from T will alter trade patterns, but they will have no impact on any nation's welfare, right? And we'll see that in a second. And the thing though about this is an economically ineffective sanction, but it will alter the trade flow so that no sanctioned goods are traded between the target and the sanctioner. So let's see this in a graphical form. So here we've got the sanctioner. It's put on a trade barrier, so that's that little bar in between the two, and M can't go through that. Or maybe it's a little one. Maybe M can go through it, but it has to pay a tariff. Okay, so it doesn't have to be a complete bar, right? It could be more of a speed hump, right? The thing is, for any additional cost imposed, we're going to see the trade pattern shift, right? Because this is a world in which the Q rho, the amount of M produced of this product produced in the rest of the world is bigger than the amount traded between the sanctioner and target. So what happens is the target, instead of exporting QST of M, right? Instead of exporting what they would have exported to the sanctioner, they export it to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world exports what they would have produced and consumed themselves to the sanctioner. And the world price doesn't change. Now, that's in a perfect, one of these frictionless plane models, I call them, where there are no transaction costs and there's instantaneous blub and transport's free, et cetera, et cetera. In these theoretical models, there's no change, right? In the real world, there would be disruption in changing trade flows, right? If trade flows shift, there would be short-term transaction costs that would have to be paid. They could be, and who knows, that's one of these things that's less well-defined, but they would be short-term in nature, and they would be mainly disruption cost. But eventually we would settle into a new trade pattern. And indeed, if there are such disruption costs or transaction costs associated with shifting the trade flow, then even if that barrier went away, even if the sanctioner and target kissed and made up and the barrier went away, this trade flow would continue, because why would you shift back? So this is a world in which there's no effect, yet there is massive shift in trade patterns. It looks like something's happening, but it really isn't. Okay, what's it take to have what I call an economically effective sanction? An economically effective sanction is a sanction that has an economic cost, imposes an economic cost on the target. Now, it may not be politically effective, right? And we could talk, certainly there is that you can distinguish between imposing costs on your target and actually getting the target to do what you want them to do, right? And so, but for imposing, the first step is you got to be able to impose the cost. So again, threshold condition. Was the amount being traded between the sanctioner and target greater than the amount of M produced in the rest of the world? QST greater than Q rho in this case. We've flipped the sign. Then, if there aren't perfect substitutes, right? If people can't shift and decide, all right, I'm not going to buy M, I'm going to buy N, right? I'm going to buy this different product and replace it. Then this, so we don't have a substitute. Then sanctions are going to adversely impact the target and the sanctioner's welfare while benefiting third parties in the process, all right? And we're going to have a note here, kind of cryptic at this point. Trade in sanctioned goods between the target and sanctioner might occur in this environment, but it's an indicator. In that case, it would still be an indicator that sanctions are working. Let's see how this is playing out in the graph. So now the sanctioner and target, their original trade, they traded this more M than is produced and consumed in the rest of the world. So when the trade barrier goes up, the target looks to, can't sell its QST, its original quantity of M, and it goes to try to sell it in the rest of the world. But guess what? At the market price, the rest of the world doesn't consume that much. Not interested. And so they are going to have to dump their product, to use it in a colloquial sense. They're going to have to sell some quantity. They might be able to sell more, right? Because they're going to lower the price, right? This is the key thing. The target is going to have to sell. It's a fire sale for the target, right? Meanwhile, in the sanctioning nation, consumers want their M, and there's not as much at the price they're used to paying at P prime. There's just not the same amount. There's less of it available. So they're probably going to, the price is going to go up, and they're going to basically buy and probably end up getting less than they used to, less than QST, less of M than they used to get for a higher price. So basically the target is going to sell less at a lower price. The sanctioner's going to buy less, but at a higher price. Both of them are suffering. And it comes from the change in world prices in this model, right? That's the mechanism. And it's contextualized by rho, right? What is rho? What are rho's supply and demand curves, right? When the target starts dumping M, how much of a discount does it have to give to the rest of the world, the consumers in the rest of the world? Similarly, producers in the rest of the world, how much do you have to jack the price to get more M out? And that will be what drives the costs separately for the target and the sanctioner. For one, it's a question. For the target, it's a question of what the demand function in rho is. For the sanctioner, it's a question of what the supply function is in rho. But it's all about rho, right? That's the key thing. And meanwhile, rho is loving life. The producers of M are selling, yeah, they're working and they're making money hand over fist. Meanwhile, the consumers of M have plentiful M at a low cost. So Roe unambiguously materially gains from this situation. Now, if the trade barrier isn't a complete barrier, if it's just, say, a tariff, right? So maybe they slapped a 50% tariff on the product, which would be pretty prohibitive in most situations. But, depending on how prices change, that might, if the world price goes up to higher than the price plus whatever the additional costs imposed by the barrier are, you could get legitimate, right? Not smuggling, not, it's not a leakage of the trade barrier, right? It's a legitimate crossing of the barrier. That's why that little thin line is there between the target and sanctioner. You could actually see some trade continue, albeit at this higher price and lower quantity, right? It just depends on whether or not the tariff barrier is itself a impervious one, or whether it's a cost adding one, whether it's a partial barrier, like an increased tariff. So this is a world in which we have an economically effective tariff. And the key things are that the sanctioner and the target both suffer costs because prices, and what we do, we basically have split prices, right? We have a split price in the world. And so the target is getting a lower than P prime price, and the sanctioner is paying a higher than P prime price, right? And so the Roe price, right, because it's the price in the rest of the world that the target is at, boom, they're selling in the rest of the world, and the price that the sanctioner is getting is higher. So this is our economically effective tariff. As I said, costs of sanctions, right? They're going to be an increasing function of the ratio of the sanctioner's initial imports to the rest of the world's initial production, right? The bigger the gap between them, the bigger the ratio, right? If we take the value of M or Q, the value, the quantity of QST, quantity QST of M that was traded originally, and divide it by the Q rest of the world, Q row, right? The bigger that is, the more the costs are going to be. Now, honestly, I don't think it necessarily has to be bigger, absolutely bigger than the QST doesn't necessarily have to be bigger than Q row in the real world. Probably if it was, we're talking market share here, and you don't have to have 100% of the market to have an impact on the market, right? I mean, and so there's a concept of smoothness or monotonicity that will come in here rather than this light switch of, the inequality. But the point here is that we have this increasing function of the sanctioner's imports from the, to the production the rest of the world originally. But it's the same thing for both of them, right? This QST divided by Q row contextualized, even though they don't have exactly the same costs, it's nevertheless the same function that describes the costs and indicates higher or lower. And it's from basically the same price. The split in the global price is from the same place, right? So costly sanctions to the target are costly sanctions to the sanctioner. So this is why I say the key takeaways here is we have the pre-existing trade level and production in the rest of the world, right? This ratio is the key thing. Rest of the world is the denominator, right? In this scenario. No, and this is very different from military calculations where we tend to calculate them bilaterally. We say Russia has this many tanks and Ukraine has that many tanks. And, we can take the ratio of them. Sometimes people will, I've seen for power calculations, you take the military, the military strength of, add both the military strengths of the people of both parties and use that as a denominator, and then one of them divided by the sum of their strength. So, Russian tanks divided by Russian tanks plus Ukrainian tanks, right, is a rough way of thinking about it. That's a bilateral ratio. Well, in this case, it's sanctioner and target, and it's the same for both of them, right? The amount of trade between them is the amount of trade between them, right? So it's the same for both of them, and it's divided by the rest of the world. So the rest of the world is the denominator, which is a very different dynamic than traditional military stuff. So what we see here is that bilateral comparisons, looking at it and saying, oh, the sanctioners got more, this trade is this percentage of their GDP, they're less relevant, right? They're maybe not completely relevant. They're probably things, but we have a very different dynamic. Also, costs are imposed on both sides and positively correlated, right? Again, there may be things that cost more, impose more of a cost on one than the other, but things that increase the cost to one will probably increase the cost to the other, and will theoretically, in literal terms of the word, increase the cost to the other. Okay, now what about the effect of coalitions? Suppose we have the sanctioner, and now let's call the sanctioner, the first sanctioner, S1, right? So S1 is the first sanctioner, right? Sanctioner 1. And sanctioner 1 gets a sanctioner 2 to join, right? I'm going to call them sanctioner 1 and sanctioner 2 because I was in the military, and S1 and S2 have a different meaning. Those are staff offices. But so sanctioner 1 gets sanctioner 2 to join in. What happens? Well, basically, sanctioner 2, its consumption and production of M, whatever that product is that we're sanctioning, moves from the denominator to the numerator, right? And we have a sanctioning coalition of 1 and 2, right? And it's got and the QST in this case is basically the quantity between sanctioner 1 and the target plus quantity originally traded between sanctioner 1 or 2 and the target, right? So those two are added together, and so the numerator grows and the denominator shrinks, unambiguously increasing the cost of the sanctions for both sides. And this is the key thing. Yes, it will increase the cost on the target, and that's why we think larger sanctioning coalitions are better, are more, I should say, more effective, because they will impose bigger costs. However, getting someone to help you out doesn't make it cheaper on you. In fact, it increases the effect. The global change in price will be magnified by the addition of another sanctioner, right? So the price you're paying is going to go up, right, when you add this person in. And for the person joining, they're going to join in on the pain, right? And they're kind of moving from row where producers and consumers of M and row were loving life. They're now moving into your world. So it really doesn't, really isn't great for two. So this is my thing is, look, with coalitions, yes, a bigger coalition will potentially be more effective. However, it will not have the effect of lowering the cost on the sanctioner. It won't make it easier on the sanctioner. In fact, it will raise costs to the sanctioner, making the conflict more painful. But pain is what we're trying to go for. But it won't. Normally when we think of a military coalition, more people, we share the burden. But different dynamic here is what I'm saying. Okay, so if we look at sanctions as coercion. One thing that is kind of hard here, the costs tend to be low to sanctioning in that they're a function, they're contextualized by the rest of the world. And very often when you sanction a nation, that nation's trade between, the trade between target and sanction are divided by the rest of the world, especially in a world that is increasingly global and increasingly large, right? There's more and more people trading out there. Rest of the world, there's a lot more trade going on. And so the odds of having a zero effect, right, where you just divert trade, but there's no change in global prices, are much higher. And the impact on global prices is going to be harder to affect with any bilateral thing, right? Now, of course, we can have coalitions, and that gets there. But basically, just think about the sanctioning as trying to affect the global price. And now you're probably thinking the right way. Also, you can't look and say, all right, the target shipped, $20 billion of M to the sanctioner, so they're going to lose 20 billion. No, when the sanctions go on, they're going to divert to selling it in the rest of the world. Now, there may be costs, again, there may be short-term costs associated with that disruption that could be very disruptive for those countries. But long-term, they're going to make up, even if it's an effective sanction, they're going to make up part of it, right? So your costs here, there can be costs, they're going to be low, or they're going to be short-term. I probably should have that in there, but we'll stay with this, right? With small targets, the costs are likely to be negligible, right? When you're sanctioning a small country, what are the odds that a small country is going to be exporting more of anything to any one nation or to the world, than is produced and consumed in the rest of the world? Now, there are exceptions to this. There are patterns of trade that we've noticed that very often production of products is concentrated in geographic areas. So there may actually be opportunities based on that give you a chance where seemingly small countries have a disproportionate share of global production of a product, and where sanctioning them might have an effect all out of proportion to their size. And that is something to look at, how the distribution of trade and of production and the geographic concentrations that often occur. This is something that Paul Krugman's talked about, because you get these economies of scale and it makes sense to produce things in the same place. And that's why there's a Silicon Valley. That's why there's a Hollywood. We have a lot of examples of these things. But is there only one, right, is the question. And it will be limited in terms of its opportunities. So that's something to keep in mind. Coalitions, as I say, are needed, but coalitions don't make it easier, right? Coalitions increase the pain for both sides, but coalitions are in a globalized world with lots of production, lots of trade moving great distances. They are potentially more important in order to meet the criteria of having an impact, right? Of getting getting that minimal level of trade that's going on interrupted. The thing, though, is that, and it's not something I discussed here, but the logic of coercion very often places an emphasis on short-term costs. What are the costs in the short term? In the long term, costs accumulated over time, if we approach it from a rational point of view, which is what the logic of coercion is about. You're trying to have someone make a rational decision to give up their policy, to comply with a demand in exchange for in exchange for not deploying a threat or stopping pain. It is inherently a cost-benefit calculation. But the game theoretic models of that, often produce imprecise or indeterminate outcomes. It's a game of chicken. Who wins a game of chicken? The guy who doesn't blink first, right? And it's a game of chicken is inherently, it has multiple equilibria, right? It doesn't have a definite outcome. And this is our problem, is we don't have a prediction of who will precisely win in one of these things. And the only way we do get that is when we have iterations, and when we know, the game theoretic model says that if somebody is willing to give up in the future, right? If there is a situation where one player would, even if they won in the next round, there was a level of conflict that was so painful to them that they would rather not go through it, they'd rather just give up, right? Then they would, that produces a definitive outcome and a winner, basically. And the thing is, if that happens in the future, the idea is the game will unravel from that point. If you're going to give up in 2 rounds, give up now, and it all unravels. But the point is that so the acute cost might be somewhere in the future in these models, but if there's never a point where the short-term costs of fighting for one more round outweigh the benefit of staying with the policy, you can always kick the can. Basically, you kick the can down the street. You kick the decision down the road a bit, and you never actually, you just keep fighting, right? And that's eventual continuation is what they call it. And so short-term costs are what's important, and they're not additive in these models. And therefore, it's hard to see how sanctions really produce that. In fact, maybe those disruptive costs up front that aren't captured by the model could do the work, but they're quickly over, right? They're quickly past, and if they don't have an impact in the early stages of the interaction, they're not going to have an impact later. So I am very skeptical that sanctions, in fact, produce a lot of it, are really a good way of coercing. So what's a better way of coercing someone? Well, I don't know. We're not looking at that. What's some other things that we could use sanctioning for? Well, sanctioning could be, make more sense if we think of it as a political communication and a symbolic action, right? Where nations communicate their support for norms, they make symbolic disassociations. Basically, it's organized non-involvement with somebody, right? That's what sanctioning is. And we are refusing to interact. Organized non-interaction. That's actually the term I've heard used by Nicholas Mulder in The Economic Weapon. And the thing is, though, that that can have an impact, right? That can be part of establishing norms around the world and signaling things. And, okay. It can also satisfy domestic audiences, right? Now, there's always kind of an assumption that domestic audiences are dumb in some way or don't realize that you're not doing anything and are satisfied with things that don't actually have an impact, which is problematic, by the way. But it could be, there is that whole thing of, hey, we need to do something, right? What can we do? Well, we can at least not trade with these guys, right? And that could satisfy a domestic audience that wants something done. Beyond that, though, weakening political opponents, right? Imposing costs might have a material impact, especially on the military preparedness of a nation. And of course, this is very often what the original stuff was, original sanctions and blockades were aimed at, right? There was always that question of, can we disrupt can we keep the Germans from getting manganese or chrome, which they need to make their really nice good steel, which they need to make cannons and stuff with, right? So can we block that? That's old school, and that could very well be, hey, if I can keep a nation, if I can impact a nation, cause some pain, slow its economic growth, slow the development of key sectors, that economic effect might be the point, not the political effect. Because the key thing is, you got to go from the economic impact of the sanctions through some kind of game, some kind of logic or interaction to a political outcome, right? There's two sides to this. And sanctions are, economic sanctions are problematic and they're mutually costly, and they don't necessarily produce big effects. There are obvious exceptions where just the whole world gangs up on someone, like Iraq, and possibly with Russia, but most of the time it's a very low cost, affair. So I think that in terms of trying to think of it in terms of the coercive impact, which is very much how it's normally thought of, right? But not always. These other roles seem to make a lot more sense given the instrument. Well, that's what I got. Sorry it took so long, but it was a third of my dissertation. Okay, there were game theory. That second stage is what I did a lot of work on. But that's the effectiveness, the economic effectiveness of sanctions.